The autumn wind in Oakhaven had a particular bite to it that year, a damp chill that clung to the cobblestones and seeped through the thickest wool. It was a wind that carried whispers of the conflict simmering just beyond the rolling hills. A conflict that made the presence of the town militia both a comfort and a constant, grim reminder. 12-year-old Leo felt it as he hurried down Market Street, the wicker basket digging into his arm. His mother's list was short, but the sinking sun urged him on. "Be home before the lamps are lit," her voice echoed in his mind. He saw them then, a familiar sight. Captain Valerius and his men, their dark green greatcoats a stark contrast to the muted browns and grays of the town. Valerius, a man whose face seemed carved from oak, nodded curtly as Leo passed, his eyes scanning every rooftop and alleyway. The militia were Oakhaven's shield. They were fathers, sons, and brothers who had taken up rifles to keep the unseen invaders at bay. To Leo, they were giants, infallible and stern, the living embodiment of safety. Wanting to shave a few minutes off his return journey, Leo ducked into the narrow passage behind the old tannery, a route he knew he should avoid. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. It was there, huddled in the shadow of a crumbling brick wall, that he saw him. A man, or perhaps a boy not much older than his own brother, was slumped against a stack of discarded barrels. His clothes were ragged, an unfamiliar shade of muddy gray, and one leg of his trousers was soaked in a dark, glistening stain. But it was the shivering that caught Leo's attention, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook the man's entire frame. Leo froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Invader. The word screamed in his thoughts. Every warning from Captain Valerius, every fearful story told by the adults, coalesced into a single knot of terror in his stomach. He should run. He should scream for the militia. But the man's head lifted, and his eyes, wide with pain and exhaustion, met Leo's. There was no malice in them, only a desperate, silent plea against the cold. He looked young, lost, and utterly defeated. The conflict within Leo was swift and fierce. Fear warred with a deeper, simpler instinct. He saw not an enemy, but a person suffering. His mother had made him take his father's old woolen jacket, just in case the wind turns. Without another thought, Leo shrugged it off his shoulders. The jacket was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and home. He took 2 hesitant steps forward, held it out, and draped it over the stranger's trembling shoulders. The man's chattering teeth stilled for a second. He gave a single, slow nod of immense gratitude. The gesture broke Leo's trance. Panic surged through him, cold and sharp. He turned and fled, not daring to look back, the basket banging against his leg as he ran, the weight of his secret far heavier than the jacket he'd left behind. Leo didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window pane, was the sound of discovery. He lay in his bed, the thin blanket a poor substitute for the warmth of the jacket he'd given away, his mind replaying the scene in the alley. The stranger's pained eyes, the tremor in his hands, the bloodstain darkening the gray stone. Guilt and fear wrestled in his chest, leaving him breathless. When the first pale light of dawn crept into his room, it brought no relief, only a heightened sense of dread. Morning in Oakhaven had a rhythm, a routine punctuated by the steady, reassuring thud of the militia's boots on the cobblestones. Leo crept to his window, peering through the glass slick with condensation. He expected to see the morning patrol, their dark uniforms a familiar and comforting sight against the town's muted colors. But the street was empty, devoid of movement. The usual 6 a.m. clang of the blacksmith's hammer from near the barracks was absent. There was only an unnerving silence, thick and heavy like a pre-storm fog. Leo's heart began to pound a frantic, sickening rhythm against his ribs. This was wrong. He wasn't the only one who noticed. As the town slowly stirred to life, a current of unease rippled through the streets. Mrs. Gable stood at the door of her bakery, her brow furrowed, her usual morning greeting to passers-by left unsaid. 2 farmers, their carts laden with produce for the market, spoke in hushed, anxious tones, their eyes scanning the empty watchtower at the edge of town. "Have you seen Captain Valerius?" The question began to whisper from doorway to doorway, a contagion of fear spreading faster than any fever. The growing anxiety finally coalesced into action. A small group, led by the town's deputy mayor, a portly man named Elias, marched with feigned confidence towards the militia's barracks. The rest of the town watched, holding its collective breath. Elias pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The silence that followed was more damning than any scream. He re-emerged moments later, his face ashen. "They're gone," he stammered, his voice barely carrying across the stunned square. "All of them, the weapons, the supplies, everything. It's empty." The word empty shattered the fragile morning calm. A woman sobbed. A man shouted in anger. The whispers erupted into a cacophony of panic. They were defenseless. The shield that had stood between them and the unseen enemy had vanished in the night, without a sound, without a trace. From his window, Leo watched the chaos unfold. The town's fear was a roaring wildfire, but his was a cold, solitary dread that settled deep in his bones. He saw the connection no one else could. The soldier in the alley. The jacket, his act of forbidden kindness. A trade had been made, one he hadn't understood. He had warmed a single enemy, and in return, the town's protectors had disappeared. The weight of it was crushing, isolating him in the middle of the terrified crowd. It was his fault. It was all his fault. The unnerving silence of dawn had shattered into a cacophony of fear. Oakhaven's central square, usually a place of quiet commerce and neighborly chats, was now a roiling mass of panicked citizens. Shouts and accusations flew through the cold air like sparks from a fire. On the steps of the town hall, Deputy Mayor Elias stood on a wooden crate, his arms raised in a plea for calm. He was a man built for paperwork and quiet council meetings, not for crisis. His voice, thin and reedy, was swallowed by the crowd's hysteria. "Please, everyone, we must remain orderly," Elias shouted, his words barely carrying over the din. "Captain Valerius would want us to adhere to protocol. We will organize a civilian watch, roster by roster." His appeal was met with scorn. "Protocol? Our protectors are gone, Elias," a blacksmith yelled, his face red with fury. "And you want us to sign up for a list? The invaders could be at our doorstep right now." From the edge of the crowd, Leo watched the chaos unfold, his stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. Each panicked shout felt like a finger pointing directly at him. He saw the deep lines of worry etched on his father's face as he held his mother close. They were looking to Elias for reassurance, for strength, and finding only a hollow echo of the authority the militia once held. The sight was unbearable. This was his fault. This terror, this vulnerability, it all began with a simple jacket. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He couldn't just stand here and watch the town he had doomed fall apart. He had to do something. He had to know. Slipping away from the crowd, unnoticed, Leo retraced his steps from the night before. His heart hammered against his ribs as he turned into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley. It looked different in the stark morning light, colder and emptier. The shadows were long and sharp, and the damp brick walls seemed to close in on him. He crept toward the spot where the soldier had been slumped. There was nothing there now but a dark, damp patch on the ground where the man had bled. Leo's eyes darted around, searching every grimy corner, every crack in the pavement. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: a button, a footprint, anything to prove it had been real, anything to explain what happened next. His fingers skimmed the rough surface of the brick wall. Just as he was about to give up, his hand brushed against something wedged into a deep fissure between two bricks. It was a small, folded piece of paper, damp from the morning frost. With trembling hands, Leo carefully worked it free. He unfolded the fragile document. It wasn't a letter or a map. It was a list. A list of names, handwritten in neat, precise script. Valerius, A. Croft, M. Hemlock, T. Leo's blood ran cold. He kept reading, his eyes widening in horror with each name he recognized. It was them. Every single member of the Oakhaven militia, from the captain down to the newest recruit. He looked at the bottom of the list and saw a final, chilling notation next to the last name: all accounted for. The soldier hadn't just been a random casualty seeking shelter. This was planned. His single act of compassion hadn't just been a mistake. It had been the final piece of a cold, calculated operation. The world outside Leo's bedroom window had shrunk to the size of the folded paper in his hand. He sat on the edge of his bed, the murmur of panicked voices from the town square, a distant, muffled hum. His parents were downstairs. He could hear their footsteps pacing restlessly, their words short and sharp with anxiety. He couldn't tell them. Seeing their fear was one thing. Knowing he was the cause of it would be unbearable. Deputy Mayor Elias was out of the question. The man was a ship's captain trying to steer through a hurricane with a broken rudder, and Leo knew handing him the list would be like handing him an anchor. He'd only sink them all faster, likely branding Leo a collaborator in the process. He unfolded the paper again under the weak afternoon light. The list of names stared back at him, a roll call of the town's vanished protectors. He ran his thumb over the coarse, cheap paper. It wasn't the smooth stock from the general store. It felt foreign, rough-spun. As his finger traced the edge, he felt a faint, raised impression in the bottom corner. He held it closer, angling it toward the window. It was a symbol, crudely pressed into the pulp. Two small, overlapping sickles contained within a circle. It wasn't a crest he recognized from any of the town families or from Captain Valerius's militia insignia. It was alien, a maker's mark of unknown origin, and it sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. This list wasn't just written by an outsider, it was printed on their paper. Down in the square, the chaos was congealing into desperate, angry clumps of people. Elias stood on the steps of the town hall, his voice strained as he tried to project an authority he didn't possess. "We need volunteers, a citizen watch, every able-bodied man." His words were swallowed by shouts. "What will we fight with, Elias?" "Sticks," yelled one man. "They took the rifles," screamed a woman. Suddenly, the crowd parted. A man, breathless and pale, stumbled through. It was Mr. Henderson, whose farm bordered the eastern woods. "They're here," he gasped, leaning against a post to catch his breath. "The fence, it's not broken. It's cut, clean through with tools." A hush fell over the crowd. "And the ground, there are prints all over the south pasture." He looked around, his eyes wide with terror. Not just a few, dozens. They're in lines like soldiers. They were marching toward Oak Haven. The word marching struck Leo like a physical blow. The organized list. The strange symbol, the methodical disappearance. And now, marching. This wasn't a random raid. It was a precise, calculated operation. The invaders hadn't just removed the militia, they had cleared the board for their next move. The list in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, hotter, like a burning coal. He now understood that revealing it would do nothing but confirm what Henderson had just told them, that they were lambs in a pen, their shepherds already taken. He backed away from the edge of the square, melting into the shadows of an alley. He had to find out what that symbol meant. It was the only question that mattered. The weight of the secret felt heavier than the damp, cold air that clung to Oak Haven streets. Leo knew he couldn't approach Deputy Mayor Elias, whose panicked attempts at leadership inspired no confidence. The symbol was his burden, his clue, and his only hope. His mind raced, sifting through the town's resources. The church had records, but only of births and deaths. The general store, unlikely. Then it struck him, the town archives. Housed in the stuffy, forgotten basement of the municipal building, it was a tomb of forgotten history, presided over by its equally forgotten keeper, Miss Albright. He found her exactly where he expected, hunched over a large ledger under the dim glow of a single desk lamp. Elara Albright was a woman as brittle and sharp as dried parchment. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her spectacles sat perched on the end of her nose, tools for scrutinizing the world and everyone in it with suspicion. "The archives are closed to the public," she stated without looking up, her voice a dry rustle. "Especially to children tracking mud." Leo froze, suddenly aware of the dirt on his boots. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's for a school project." The lie felt thin and flimsy in the heavy silence of the room. About the founding families, their old symbols for history. Miss Albright finally lifted her eyes, and they pinned Leo in place. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. A history project. Now, with the town on the verge of tearing itself apart, her lips thinned. A curious time for academic pursuits, young man. Before Leo could respond, a new sound cut through the quiet tension, a frantic ringing of the town bell, followed by panicked shouts from the square outside. Miss Albright's head snapped toward the small basement window. What now? She muttered, her annoyance layered over a flicker of genuine fear. More voices joined the chorus, a wave of alarm. Someone was shouting about the water pump at the main well, that it had seized completely, the handle snapped clean off. Sabotage, the word screamed in Leo's mind. It was too precise, too crippling. First the militia, now the water supply. They were being dismantled piece by piece. The external chaos only fueled his internal desperation. He looked back at Miss Albright, his face paler than before. Please, Miss Albright, it's important. It's about agricultural symbols, like the ones the first farming guilds might have used. He prayed the specificity would make it sound more credible. Her gaze lingered on him, her mind clearly working. She saw his fear, the tremor in his hands. Perhaps she mistook it for general anxiety about the town's situation, or perhaps she sensed something more. With a weary sigh, she gestured toward a dusty corner. Old guild and commerce records are in that section. Do not misplace anything. I will be watching. With his heart pounding a rhythm of pure dread, Leo hurried to the shelves. His hands, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled as he pulled down heavy, leather-bound books. He worked with frantic urgency, the shouts from outside a constant reminder that the clock was ticking. He flipped through pages of faded ink, scanning past land deeds and trade manifests, his eyes searching for one thing. He found a chapter on agricultural collectives. There, amongst various symbols for grain merchants and livestock traders, he saw it. Not an exact match, but terrifyingly close. A single sickle. His breath hitched. As he leaned closer, a shadow fell over the page. Find what you were looking for. Miss Albright's voice was quiet, dangerously close, and stripped of all pretense. The weight of Miss Albright's hand on his shoulder felt as heavy as the dusty silence in the archives. Her sharp, gray eyes, magnified by her spectacles, were fixed on him, demanding an answer. The scent of old parchment and binding glue filled Leo's lungs, thick with accusation. Panic flared in his chest, hot and sharp, but he forced it down. Lying wouldn't work, not with her. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled list. He didn't offer the whole truth, but a piece of it felt safer than a full fabrication. I found this, he whispered, his voice cracking. In the alley behind the bakers, this morning. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the heavy oak table, his finger pointing directly at the damning symbol pressed into the parchment, the two crossed sickles. Miss Albright's expression shifted. The stern suspicion in her eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of alarm. She leaned closer, her gaze tracing the handwritten names, men she had known her entire life, men who had served her tea, fixed her fence, and tipped their hats to her in the street. Her lips thinned into a grim line. When her eyes settled on the symbol, a different kind of recognition dawned on her face, something cold and ancient. The harvesters, she breathed, the words like a ghost in the quiet room. She straightened up, her demeanor transformed. The librarian was gone. In her place stood a historian facing a tangible piece of the dark past she chronicled. Come with me, quickly. Without another word, she turned and led him past the public shelves, unlocking a heavy iron-gated door that led to a small, windowless room filled with the oldest and most fragile records. The air here was even cooler, heavy with the weight of forgotten history. She ran a practiced hand along a row of thick, leather-bound tomes before pulling one out. It was unmarked, its cover dark with age. She opened it on a reading stand, her fingers flipping through brittle pages until she stopped at an illustration. It was the same symbol, rendered in faded ink. This is not a guild crest, she explained, her voice low and urgent. It's a mark of conquest. a brand used by a mercenary company from over a century ago. They called themselves the Harvesters of the Fields. We just called them Reapers. Leo stared at the drawing, his blood running cold. Reapers, they were methodical, Miss Albright continued, her eyes dark with the grim tale. They never attacked a town head-on. First, they would infiltrate and remove its protectors, the scythes of the community. Then, they'd sow chaos, sabotage, fear, break the town's spirit. She tapped a paragraph of text. Finally, when the town was defenseless and demoralized, they would move in to harvest its wealth, its supplies, everything of value. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The missing militia, the broken water pump. It wasn't random, it was a playbook. The soldier in the alley wasn't just a wounded enemy, he was a reaper, one of the first. And Leo had helped him. Just as this devastating realization settled over him, a new sound shattered the archival quiet. It was the frantic, desperate clang of the town's emergency bell, not the steady toll for a meeting, but a chaotic, panicked ringing that spoke of disaster. A moment later, a frantic shout echoed from the main square outside. "Fire! The grain mill is on fire!" Miss Albright looked up from the ancient book, her face pale. Leo met her gaze, the sound of the alarm a horrifying confirmation of her words. The harvest had begun. The tolling bell was a frantic heartbeat against the roar of the fire. Smoke, thick and acrid, clawed at their throats as Leo and Miss Albright burst from the archives into a nightmare. Orange light flickered across the faces of panicked townspeople, running in every direction, their shouts swallowed by the growing inferno at the grain mill. Deputy Mayor Thomas stood near the town hall, his face ashen, yelling orders that no one heard. "Thomas!" Miss Albright's voice cut through the noise with surprising force. She seized his arm, her grip firm. "They are the harvesters. This is the final stage. They're coming to collect." "What are you talking about?" Thomas sputtered, his eyes wide with fear. Leo stepped forward, holding out the crumpled list. "They took the militia first, then the water pump, now the grain. They aren't just attacking us, they're taking us apart." The pieces clicked into place behind the deputy mayor's panicked expression. The calculated cruelty of it all was more terrifying than a simple raid. He looked from the burning mill to the faces of the terrified citizens, his authority crumbling. It was Leo who spoke next, his voice ringing with a clarity that belied his age. "They think we're helpless. They think we'll scatter." He looked past Thomas to the people huddled nearby. "Miss Albright said they avoid a costly fight. They want an easy harvest. We have to make it hard." Miss Albright nodded, her mind racing through old town maps and forgotten histories. "The Narrows, Miller's Bridge, and the old Tannery Alley. If we can blockade them, we force them through the main square. We make them fight for every foot." A spark of hope ignited in the chaos. It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was a plan. Seeing a path forward offered by a boy and the town historian, Thomas finally found his voice. "You heard them. To the square. Barricade the bridge. Move." What followed was not a military drill, but an act of communal defiance. Farmers overturned heavy wagons, merchants dragged counters from their shops, and families piled furniture into makeshift walls. They worked under the pale, smoky moonlight, a frantic energy binding them together. Leo, no longer just a boy racked with guilt, moved among them, pointing out weak spots, his eyes sharp and focused. From the church bell tower, he watched as dawn threatened to break. A small team of harvesters, clad in dark, practical gear, emerged from the woods. They moved with a chilling efficiency, expecting to find a broken town ripe for plunder. Instead, they found a maze. As they approached Miller's Bridge, they were met with a formidable, silent blockade. Leo raised a pair of old binoculars to his eyes. He scanned the figures, and his breath caught. One of them, standing slightly apart from the leader, wore a familiar dark green jacket, his jacket. The soldier looked up toward the steeple, almost as if he knew Leo was there. For a single, stretched second, their eyes met across the distance. The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head before turning to his commander. He gestured towards the fortified town, then back towards the woods. The message was clear. This was no longer an easy prize. The leader stared at the barricades for a long moment, weighing the cost. Then, with a curt signal, the harvesters turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. Oak Haven was quiet. The sun rose over a town that was scarred, smoky, but unbroken. They hadn't won a glorious battle. They had simply refused to be victims. As Leo descended the winding stairs, the heavy weight of his secret finally lifted. His act hadn't been a betrayal. It had been the first, unknowing move in their defense. Miss Albright met him at the bottom, her face smudged with soot but her eyes shining with pride. "You see, Leo," she said softly, "sometimes the most compassionate heart is also the strongest shield."